Brooksville had always prided itself on being a peaceful, close-knit community, a place where life moved slowly, and people were content to let it stay that way. On any given morning, the hum of quiet conversations drifted through the town's small diner, where locals met to discuss the usual topics: the weather, the latest high school football game, and sometimes, if gossip was light, the Sunday sermon at St. Andrew's Church. But on that cold autumn morning, something darker was hanging in the air. The first sign that something was wrong came when the police cruiser sped through the town square, lights flashing. The officers weren't rushing to break up a petty squabble or a minor fender bender. Their faces were set with the kind of grim determination that suggested something far more serious. Something out of the ordinary had happened in Brooksville. Something terrible. By noon, the once quiet town was buzzing with speculation. What had been an unremarkable Wednesday had quickly turned into a day the townspeople would never forget. Eric Whitman, a well-known local man, was dead, and his body had been discovered in a place no one expected: St. Andrew's Church. The details were scarce, but one thing was clear: this wasn't an accident. Brooksville, for the first time in recent memory, was now the scene of a murder. The discovery was made by the church custodian George Hall, a man in his late 60s who had served St. Andrews for over 2 decades. George had come to the church early that morning to clean, just as he did every Wednesday. But as he stepped inside the cool, dim sanctuary, something felt off. The air seemed heavier than usual, and an eerie silence hung in the room. When George approached the altar, his breath caught in his throat. There, sprawled in the shadow of the altar, was Eric Whitman, motionless. By the time the police arrived, George was still in shock, muttering incoherently about what he had seen. It wasn't long before the entire town knew that something dreadful had happened at the church. Word traveled fast in Brooksville, and soon the rumor mill was working overtime. How had Eric, a man known for his discipline and composure, ended up dead in a place of worship? The town was left to grapple with a flood of questions, none of which had any easy answers. At first glance, Eric had the kind of life that most people envied. He had served his country as a captain in the Air Force, and later built a successful career as a private security consultant. His wife, Catherine, was admired for her grace and community involvement. Together, they seemed like the perfect couple, stable, kind, and devoted to their family. But as anyone in Brooksville would tell you, no life is as perfect as it appears from the outside. The Whitman household had always been one of respect and routine, but in recent months, those who knew Catherine had noticed subtle changes. She had become more reserved, more withdrawn, her usual brightness dimmed. Some chalked it up to the pressures of raising 2 children, while Eric was often away for work. But others whispered that something else was at play. No one could put their finger on it, but there was a growing sense that Catherine's life wasn't as picture-perfect as it seemed. The police wasted no time launching an investigation into Eric's death, but the more they dug, the more elusive the truth became. Catherine's initial shock at the news of her husband's death seemed genuine enough, but there were questions, unanswered questions, questions that hung in the air, heavy and unsettling, like a storm waiting to break. As detectives canvassed the area around St. Andrews, speaking to neighbors and parishioners, one name kept coming up: Father Nicholas. The new priest had arrived in Brooksville a little over a year ago, bringing with him a magnetic presence that quickly endeared him to the town. His sermons were captivating, filled with passion and wisdom, and it wasn't long before he had earned the trust and admiration of nearly everyone in the community. But as the detectives pressed deeper, whispers began to circulate. Whispers that suggested Father Nicholas knew more about Eric's death than he was letting on. People began to remember moments that seemed odd in retrospect. Glances exchanged, hushed conversations, small details that had once seemed insignificant, but now felt heavy with meaning. No one could say for sure what had happened inside that church. But one thing was becoming painfully clear: the peaceful facade of Brooksville was cracking, and whatever lay beneath was something no one in the town had anticipated. The news of Eric Whitman's murder spread quickly through Brooksville, and for Catherine Whitman, the hours that followed blurred into an endless haze of police questioning and whispered speculation. The calm, structured life she had once known was abruptly shattered, replaced by the stark, overwhelming reality of her husband's violent death. Sitting at the kitchen table, her hands trembling around the untouched cup of tea, Catherine tried to process the chaos that had descended on her once orderly world. In the back of her mind, Catherine had anticipated this moment in some form, though not in such a brutal way. Secrets couldn't remain hidden forever, she knew that. But this, Eric dead, the police asking questions, and the prying eyes of Brooksville fixed on her every move, she had never imagined the unthinkable would unfold like this. From the outside, her marriage to Eric had seemed unshakable. People saw the decorated Air Force veteran and his devoted wife and believed they had it all: a stable home, 2 children, and a life built on mutual respect. But behind closed doors, Catherine had long felt the growing distance between them. Eric's work as a security consultant often took him away for extended periods, leaving her to manage the household alone. And over time, the silence between them grew colder and more oppressive. It was that silence, the loneliness, that had started everything. At first, Catherine had tried to fill the void with volunteer work and community projects, spending more time at the church and participating in activities that could distract her from the isolation she felt at home. But the emptiness followed her everywhere, clinging to her, even in the most bustling of environments. Then, Father Nicholas had entered her life. The new priest at St. Andrew's Church had arrived just over a year ago, his charismatic personality quickly earning him the admiration of the congregation. His sermons were captivating, his presence comforting, and for Catherine, who was searching for a connection, he became an unexpected confidant. Their conversations started out as innocent exchanges, discussions about her faith, her struggles with Eric's long absences, and her growing sense of detachment from the life she once knew. Father Nicholas seemed to understand her in a way no one else did. As the weeks passed, their relationship deepened. Catherine found herself drawn to the priest, not just as a spiritual advisor, but as a man who made her feel seen and heard. Their conversations, once confined to public spaces, began to stretch into private moments. A shared glance here, a quiet conversation there. Eventually, what began as an emotional connection evolved into something more dangerous. The line between guidance and temptation blurred, and Catherine crossed it. It had happened late one night when she had gone to the church seeking solace. In the quiet, dimly lit chapel, Father Nicholas had found her, and in that intimate moment, the tension that had been building between them boiled over. What followed was inevitable. From that night on, everything changed for Catherine. She had started an affair with the priest, and from that point forward, secrecy became a part of her daily life. Now, as she sat at her kitchen table, Eric dead, and the weight of the police investigation looming over her, Catherine couldn't help but wonder how things had spiraled so far out of control. Her marriage had been strained for years, but she never imagined it would end like this, with Eric gone, and her own future hanging by a thread. The questions from the police had been relentless, probing every corner of her life. Catherine had told them what she could without revealing too much, speaking about the pressures Eric faced in his job and the growing distance between them, but she hadn't mentioned Father Nicholas. The affair remained a carefully guarded secret, one she wasn't ready to expose, especially not now, with the eyes of the entire town on her. Deep down, she knew she couldn't keep this up forever. The police were digging deeper, asking more questions, and her ability to maintain her composure was slipping with each passing hour. She hadn't seen Father Nicholas since the morning the police arrived. He had been calm on the phone, assuring her that everything would be fine. But Catherine didn't believe him. How could things be fine when her husband was dead, and the walls were closing in around her? The thought of the affair coming to light terrified her. Would Father Nicholas stay quiet? Could she trust him to protect their secret? The uncertainty gnawed at her as the investigation pressed forward. Catherine's mind raced as she considered all the things she hadn't yet told the police. There were so many unanswered questions about Eric, about her behavior in recent weeks, about the night he disappeared. She had already lied once, claiming she had been home that night, but she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep up the facade. As the hours dragged on, Catherine realized this was only the beginning. The truth about Eric's death, about her affair with Father Nicholas, about everything she had tried so desperately to hide, was bound to come out sooner or later, and when it did, there would be no going back. As the days passed following Eric's murder, Brooksville seemed to stand still in the weight of the tragedy. The small town had never seen anything like this. An unsolved murder right in their church. A man like Eric Whitman, dead under suspicious circumstances. The peaceful routine of the townspeople gave way to anxious speculation. But while Brooksville gossiped and speculated, the investigation into Eric's death was anything but stagnant. Detective Olivia Mercer, relentless in her pursuit of the truth, had begun to piece together a picture of Eric's last days that didn't align with the story Catherine had presented. There were too many gaps, too many discrepancies in her timeline. Mercer's instincts told her that Catherine was hiding something big. And the longer she dug, the more certain she became that the widow knew more than she was letting on. The forensics team had combed through St. Andrew's Church with painstaking precision, and though the crime scene had been meticulously cleaned, there were traces of evidence. Small, but enough to indicate that Eric's murder had been violent, swift, and coldly executed. The blood splatters on the altar, though minimal, suggested that whoever had killed Eric had done so up close, in an act of desperation or rage. Meanwhile, Catherine's behavior had begun to shift. Where she had once appeared grief-stricken, she now seemed distant, her mind elsewhere as the town mourned the loss of her husband. There was something off about her, Mercer thought, a kind of distraction that didn't come from simple grief. The more Mercer studied her, the more she sensed that Catherine's mind was occupied with something far deeper than sorrow. As the police delved deeper into Eric's personal life, they unearthed details that painted a complicated picture of his relationship with Catherine. Their marriage had been troubled, yes, but there were more troubling signs beneath the surface. Eric's work as a private security consultant, which had taken him away from home for days at a time, had caused fractures in their relationship. Catherine had grown more isolated in the months leading up to his death, according to friends and neighbors, and her involvement with the church had intensified. But what caught Mercer's attention most were the subtle whispers that had started to circulate about Father Nicholas. Father Nicholas was well liked in Brooksville. His sermons were stirring, his presence magnetic, but rumors had begun to swirl about his closeness to Catherine. Several parishioners recalled seeing them in deep conversation after Mass, often staying behind after everyone else had left. And though their interactions had been discreet, there was enough suspicion in the air to make Mercer's investigation take a new direction. Quietly, Mercer ordered surveillance of Father Nicholas, not wanting to tip him off that he was a person of interest in the case. Meanwhile, she kept the pressure on Catherine. The widow had given conflicting statements about her whereabouts on the night of Eric's murder, and Mercer intended to find out why. The tension in Catherine's life was unbearable. She could feel the walls closing in on her, suffocating her as the investigation progressed. The weight of her secrets pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She had thought she could keep the affair hidden, but now, with the police asking more questions and Mercer watching her every move, Catherine knew she was running out of time. She hadn't seen Father Nicholas in days, and the lack of communication between them only heightened her paranoia. As she walked through Brooksville, she could feel the eyes of the townspeople on her. People whispered behind her back, their glances filled with a mixture of pity and suspicion. Catherine had always been a well-liked figure in the community, but now she was an object of curiosity. The more the rumors spread, the more alienated she felt. Her once cozy familiar town now felt like a cage she couldn't escape from. One afternoon, as Catherine returned from the grocery store, she noticed a figure standing at the edge of her driveway. Mrs. Collins, the town's most notorious busybody, was waiting for her, arms crossed, her expression smug. Catherine felt a wave of anxiety wash over her. She didn't need this right now. Mrs. Collins was known for prying into the lives of everyone in town, and Catherine had no doubt she was itching to know more about Eric's death, and, more disturbingly, her relationship with Father Nicholas. "You've been looking tired lately, Catherine," Mrs. Collins said, her voice dripping with feigned concern. "I imagine it's hard, with everything going on, all the questions, all the eyes on you." Catherine forced a smile, trying to keep her composure, but inside, her nerves were fraying. She could feel Mrs. Collins' gaze on her, sharp and probing, as if the woman knew more than she was letting on. Mrs. Collins had seen Catherine at the church late at night before. She was sure of it. How much had the old woman witnessed? And more importantly, how much had she told the police? As soon as Catherine shut the door behind her, she collapsed onto the couch, her heart racing. She knew she couldn't keep this up. Every interaction, every look from someone in town felt like another nail in the coffin. The pressure was building, and she was nearing her breaking point. That evening, alone in her house, Catherine poured herself a glass of wine and sat in the darkened living room. Her thoughts raced, darting from one worry to the next. She kept thinking about Father Nicholas, about the last time they had seen each other, the promises they had made to keep their affair secret. But could she trust him, or was he going to let her take the fall for everything? The knock at the door startled her. For a moment she froze, her pulse quickening. It was late, too late for visitors. Slowly, she rose from the couch and made her way to the front door, her hand trembling as she reached for the knob. When she opened the door, she was greeted by the sight of Detective Mercer, standing in the doorway with a look that sent a chill down Catherine's spine. Mercer's presence wasn't a surprise, but her timing was unsettling. She had come with more questions, always more questions. And this time, Catherine knew the detective wasn't going to be satisfied with vague answers. Inside, as Mercer scanned the room with her sharp eyes, Catherine felt trapped. The detective didn't say much at first, but her silence was unnerving. Catherine could feel the weight of the investigation bearing down on her. The walls of her home, once a place of comfort, now felt like they were closing in. As Mercer methodically went over Catherine's statements again, pointing out the inconsistencies, Catherine's mind raced. She could barely focus on what Mercer was saying, too consumed by the mounting panic in her chest. The questions were too pointed, too direct. How long until Mercer figured it out? How long until the police discovered the truth about her affair with Father Nicholas? Mercer wasn't just asking about the night of the murder anymore. She was probing deeper, asking questions about Catherine's relationship with Father Nicholas, about her frequent visits to the church, about the strange tension between her and her husband in the months leading up to his death. Catherine's answers came slowly, her voice wavering with each response. When Mercer finally left, the tension didn't leave with her. Catherine felt as though she was suffocating under the weight of her lies. She hadn't told Mercer everything. She hadn't confessed to the affair, to the secret meetings, to the guilt that gnawed at her every waking moment. But she knew that the truth couldn't stay hidden forever. It was only a matter of time before everything unraveled. And when it did, there would be no escaping the consequences. The days following Mercer's visit felt like a tightening noose around Catherine's neck. Every hour brought new waves of anxiety, the constant dread of the inevitable truth coming to light. The police were circling closer, and it wasn't just Mercer's sharp questions that haunted Catherine. It was the way the entire town seemed to be watching her every move. In Brooksville, gossip wasn't just a pastime, it was a currency, and Catherine knew that her neighbors were exchanging rumors about her with the same excitement they reserved for town fairs and football games. The whispers had grown louder, the questions sharper. She could feel their eyes following her wherever she went, their judgment heavy in the air. But none of that compared to the weight of the secrets she carried within herself. The affair with Father Nicholas had started as something Catherine believed she could control. She thought it would be a fleeting escape, a reprieve from the crushing loneliness that had overtaken her life. But now, it felt like a prison. Worse, it felt like a noose tightening with every passing day. The police had ramped up their investigation, and rumors of Father Nicholas's involvement in Eric's murder were beginning to spread. For all his charisma and his connection with the town, the priest was no longer above suspicion. Catherine hadn't spoken to him since the day of the murder, and the silence between them was becoming unbearable. Had he abandoned her to take the fall alone, or was he simply lying low, hoping that the heat would die down before anyone connected them? One morning, as Catherine stepped out of her house to get the mail, she noticed something unusual. Parked just down the street, barely visible behind a row of trees, was an unmarked car. It hadn't been there the day before. A cold dread crept up her spine as she realized what it meant. The police were watching her. Mercer had likely ordered surveillance, and now they were quietly monitoring her every move. Catherine's mind raced. What if they had been watching her all along? What if they had already discovered something that could unravel everything she had fought to keep hidden? She had been careful, hadn't she? Every meeting with Father Nicholas had been discreet. They had always been cautious, but caution wasn't the same as foolproof. A small mistake, an overlooked detail, could be enough to destroy her. Inside her house, Catherine paced back and forth, her heart pounding as she considered her options. The longer she waited, the more dangerous it became. But she couldn't go to the police. Not now, not with everything on the line. She could only hope that Father Nicholas had a plan, that he was working behind the scenes to cover their tracks. But the silence from him was deafening. The pressure was beginning to affect every aspect of her life. Catherine had stopped going to church, unwilling to face the curious stares of the congregation. Her friends had grown distant, sensing that something was wrong, but too afraid to ask. Even her children, once her source of comfort, seemed like strangers to her now. They were too young to understand what was happening, but they could sense that their mother was different, more withdrawn, more distant than ever before. As the days dragged on, Catherine found herself reliving the night of Eric's death over and over again in her mind. The guilt gnawed at her constantly, an unbearable weight she carried with her every moment. She hadn't been there when it happened, but she knew, deep down, that she was responsible. Her affair with Father Nicholas had set everything in motion. If she hadn't crossed that line, Eric would still be alive. That thought consumed her, poisoning every quiet moment with regret and fear. One evening, just as dusk was settling over Brooksville, Catherine's phone rang. She hesitated before answering, her heart jumping into her throat when she saw the name on the screen, Father Nicholas. The sound of his voice on the other end of the line was both a relief and a source of new dread. He spoke in quick, hushed tones as though he were afraid someone might be listening. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by a jittery, frantic energy that set Catherine's nerves on edge. He told her that the police were closing in on him. Mercer had questioned him again, this time more aggressively. They were asking about his whereabouts the night of the murder, about his relationship with Catherine. His answers had been vague, but Mercer wasn't someone who was easily fooled. "She had a way of looking at you," Nicholas said, "that made you feel like she already knew the truth. She was just waiting for you to admit it." The weight of his words hit Catherine like a tidal wave. If Mercer was closing in on Father Nicholas, it wouldn't be long before she turned her attention back to Catherine. They were running out of time. And then came the real bombshell. Nicholas was leaving Brooksville. He couldn't risk staying any longer, not with the police closing in on him. He had connections outside the town, people who could help him disappear. Catherine felt a cold panic settle in her chest. He was leaving, and what about her? What was she supposed to do? Nicholas didn't have any answers for her. He was more focused on his own survival, his own escape. But his final words before hanging up left Catherine more shaken than ever. "I'm sorry." With that, the line went dead, and Catherine was left standing in the middle of her living room, phone still in hand, as the full weight of her situation crashed down on her. Father Nicholas was abandoning her. She was alone. The following days were a blur of anxiety and fear. Catherine barely slept, her mind racing with 1,000 different scenarios, each one worse than the last. She kept expecting the knock at the door, the moment when the police would arrive to take her away. But it never came. Instead, it was something far worse. On a rainy afternoon, as Catherine sat by the window watching the storm clouds gather, a police car pulled up in front of her house. Her heart stopped. She watched frozen as Detective Mercer stepped out of the car and made her way up the driveway. This was it. It was over. Mercer knocked on the door, and Catherine opened it with trembling hands. But to her surprise, the detective didn't come inside. Instead, she stood on the porch, her eyes locking with Catherine's in a way that made her blood run cold. In her hand, Mercer held a small, sealed evidence bag. Through the clear plastic, Catherine could see a thin silver chain, one she recognized immediately. It was Eric's necklace, the one she had given him for their anniversary years ago. Mercer's voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the edge of triumph in her words. The necklace had been found in the basement of St. Andrew's Church, tucked away behind a stack of old books. It had been stained with blood, Eric's blood. Catherine's world began to spin as Mercer's words sank in. She hadn't been careful enough. There had been something they missed. And now, with this piece of evidence, Mercer had everything she needed to tie the murder back to her and Father Nicholas. Mercer didn't arrest her that day. She didn't need to. The look in her eyes said everything. Catherine was trapped, and there was no way out. As the rain continued to fall, Catherine stood frozen in the doorway, watching as Mercer walked back to her car. The detective had left her with a final unspoken message: "We're coming for you." Catherine's world had already begun to collapse. But the discovery of Eric's blood-stained necklace in the basement of St. Andrew's Church sent the investigation into overdrive. With this crucial piece of evidence, Detective Mercer knew the case was ready to break wide open. The necklace was more than just a clue. It was the direct link between Eric's murder and the secret Catherine had been so desperately trying to hide. Mercer wasted no time. Within hours of the discovery, the forensic team descended on St. Andrew's Church for a second, more intense sweep. What had previously been considered a routine crime scene was now viewed with heightened scrutiny. The blood-stained necklace meant there was more to uncover, and Mercer was determined to find it. Inside the church, the team worked methodically, combing through every inch of the basement, the altar, and the hidden corners that had been overlooked during the initial investigation. It wasn't long before they found something else, a faint trail of blood, barely visible, leading from the back of the church toward a storage closet near the vestry. The forensic team followed the trail, hearts pounding with the anticipation of what they might find. Inside the storage closet, they made the most damning discovery yet: an old wooden chest tucked away beneath a pile of dusty linens. When they pried it open, the stench hit them immediately, rotting, metallic, unmistakable. Wrapped in a blood-soaked cloth was a second piece of evidence that sent shockwaves through the investigation: Eric's missing wristwatch, shattered and smeared with dried blood. The significance of the watch couldn't be overstated. Eric had worn it every day, a treasured gift from his military days, engraved with the insignia of his Air Force unit. The fact that it was hidden deep within the church confirmed one thing: Eric had been attacked there, and whoever had tried to hide the evidence hadn't done a good enough job. Mercer, seeing the pieces fall into place, knew it was time to confront Catherine again, but this time, she wasn't interested in watching the widow squirm. This time, Mercer was playing to win. Within hours of the discovery, Mercer issued an arrest warrant for Catherine. The charges, obstruction of justice and possible complicity in Eric's murder. Catherine was brought into the station, not as a grieving widow, but as a prime suspect. Her calm facade was gone. The pressure was finally too much for her to bear. The interrogation room felt colder than usual as Catherine sat across from Mercer, her hands cuffed to the metal table. Gone were the days of polite questioning. This was the turning point. Catherine's pale face reflected her inner fear as Mercer laid out the evidence piece by piece. The necklace, the wristwatch, the blood trail leading through the church. Mercer didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to threaten. The facts were doing all the work for her. The weight of the evidence was so overwhelming that even Catherine, who had clung to the hope of maintaining her secret, knew she was cornered. Her silence spoke volumes. While Mercer pressed Catherine, another crucial lead surfaced. One of the forensic team members, analyzing the blood patterns in the church, found something off. A second set of footprints, faint but distinct, leading away from the site where Eric had likely been killed. They weren't Catherine's. They were larger, heavier, and pointed toward a back entrance rarely used by parishioners. Mercer, now certain that there had been another person involved, began connecting the dots. Father Nicholas, his involvement in the murder, had always been a lurking suspicion, but now, with the discovery of the second set of footprints, Mercer was ready to officially link him to the crime scene. A warrant was issued for Father Nicholas's arrest, but when the police arrived at the rectory to bring him in, they found it empty. Father Nicholas had vanished. His belongings were gone, his cell phone disconnected. He had fled Brooksville, leaving behind a tangled mess of lies, deceit, and murder. But as the investigation intensified, Mercer wasn't content to let the trail go cold. She turned her focus to the possibility that Father Nicholas hadn't gone far. Despite the police's best efforts, Brooksville's geography, a town surrounded by dense woods and rural roads, provided plenty of places for someone to hide. A massive manhunt was launched. Every available officer in Brooksville and neighboring counties was called in to help search for the fugitive priest. Helicopters flew overhead, combing the woods for any sign of movement, while teams of officers set up roadblocks on the highways leading out of town. The FBI even sent in specialized trackers to assist with the manhunt. Days passed, and the town remained on edge. Father Nicholas was still missing, but Mercer refused to give up. She knew that someone in Brooksville must have been helping him. He couldn't have disappeared without assistance. Mercer began interviewing anyone who had been close to Father Nicholas in the days leading up to his disappearance. Parishioners, friends, acquaintances. No one was above suspicion. It was during one of these interviews that a breakthrough came. David Latimer, a church handyman who had been seen frequently around St. Andrews, came under the radar when it was discovered that his vehicle had been spotted near a remote cabin just outside of town. A cabin he had inherited from his late uncle, but rarely used. Mercer, trusting her instincts, sent a team to the cabin immediately. What they found there was both shocking and horrific. Inside the cabin, hidden beneath a trapdoor in the floor, was Father Nicholas. He was dirty, disheveled, and clearly in distress. But worse than his appearance was the fact that he wasn't alone. In the corner of the small, damp cellar was a makeshift shrine. A series of twisted relics in blood-stained clothing, including a set of priest's robes that had been smeared with dried blood. As the police arrested Father Nicholas, they found yet another grim discovery, a diary. In it, Father Nicholas had chronicled his descent into madness, detailing his obsession with Catherine, his growing paranoia about Eric discovering their affair, and, most chillingly, his confession to the murder. The diary told the story that Catherine never could. Father Nicholas had lured Eric to the church under the guise of a late-night confession, knowing full well what he intended to do. In a fit of rage, he had attacked Eric, bludgeoning him to death with a heavy iron candle holder. In the aftermath, he had panicked, hiding the body and the evidence, never expecting that the truth would come to light. With Father Nicholas in custody and the horrifying details of the crime now public, the town of Brooksville was left to reckon with the dark truth that had festered beneath their seemingly peaceful surface. Catherine, though not directly involved in the murder, was charged with obstruction of justice and conspiracy. Her trial would become a spectacle, drawing national attention as the media delved deeper into the twisted affair between the widow and the priest. The town would never be the same. The capture of Father Nicholas sent shockwaves through Brooksville, but it was far from the end of the story. His arrest marked only the beginning of dark revelations, ones that would forever alter the quiet town's once peaceful existence. Detective Mercer, relentless in her pursuit of justice, knew that the case wasn't over. There were still lingering questions, deep secrets left to uncover. Secrets about Catherine's involvement and the hidden layers of darkness within St. Andrew's Church. The discovery of Father Nicholas's blood-stained robes and the grisly shrine in his cabin added an even more grotesque dimension to the case. Forensic experts meticulously sifted through every inch of evidence, focusing on the priest's chilling diary, which had laid bare his confessions. The diary detailed Father Nicholas's growing obsession, not just with Catherine, but with his own twisted interpretation of his role as a priest. His descent into madness had reached a fever pitch, culminating in the murder of Eric Whitman. However, the diary hinted at something even more insidious. Father Nicholas's belief that his actions were a divine mission, a grotesque perversion of his faith. As Father Nicholas was held in custody, the interrogation began. The once charismatic priest had transformed into a hollow, almost deranged figure. His eyes, which once held the calm confidence of a man in control, now darted nervously as Mercer and her team pressed him for details. His initial responses were incoherent, filled with religious allusions and ramblings about divine punishment. He claimed that Eric's death was part of God's judgment, a result of sin and his own inability to maintain control. But it wasn't until Mercer pushed him about Catherine's role that Father Nicholas's fragile composure crumbled. His voice cracked, sweat beading on his forehead, as he finally admitted that Catherine had known about his intentions to confront Eric. However, he was adamant that she had no direct involvement in the murder itself. Mercer remained skeptical. Catherine had concealed the affair for months, and her silence following Eric's death was more than suspicious. While Catherine may not have physically struck the fatal blow, her deception and complicity had undoubtedly contributed to Eric's murder. Mercer understood that this made Catherine culpable in her own right, if not directly, then as an accomplice. As the interrogation wore on, Father Nicholas revealed more unsettling details. He confessed that after killing Eric, he had planned to flee Brooksville with Catherine. In his delusional state, he had envisioned a life away from the church and its judgment, free to pursue his relationship with Catherine without consequence. But panic had set in after the murder, and instead of following through with his plan, he had fled alone, leaving Catherine behind. While Father Nicholas languished in his cell, awaiting formal charges, Mercer's focus shifted back to Catherine. Released on bail, she faced charges of obstruction of justice and conspiracy. Yet Mercer knew there was more to uncover. The trial loomed, and public scrutiny surrounding Catherine's role in both the affair and Eric's murder intensified. The media was relentless, digging into Catherine's life, revealing every sordid detail: her deteriorating marriage, her secret meetings with Father Nicholas, and her increasingly erratic behavior in the months leading up to Eric's death. Catherine's once pristine image as a grieving widow had been obliterated. Now, she was seen as a woman who had not only betrayed her husband, but had been complicit in his death. As Brooksville teetered on the brink of chaos, a new twist emerged. A former parishioner named Annabelle Croft came forward with disturbing allegations against Father Nicholas. Annabelle had left St. Andrew's months before Eric's murder, but her testimony painted a damning picture of the priest's behavior long before the fatal events unfolded. According to Annabelle, Father Nicholas had manipulated her under the guise of spiritual guidance, preying on her vulnerabilities much like he had done with Catherine. Though their relationship never escalated into a physical affair, Annabelle sensed something deeply unsettling about the priest's intentions and had distanced herself from the church. Her claims added weight to the growing suspicion that Father Nicholas had been using his position to manipulate women for years. Mercer wasted no time in incorporating Annabelle's testimony into the case against Father Nicholas, but it also raised further questions about Catherine's role. Had Catherine been another victim of the priest's manipulation, or had she willingly participated in his deceit? Catherine's trial soon became a national spectacle. The courtroom overflowed with spectators, reporters jostling for the perfect shot of the woman now infamously linked to Brooksville's darkest hour. The prosecution wasted no time in portraying Catherine as a willing accomplice. They detailed her affair with Father Nicholas, her deception of the authorities, and her silence in the face of her husband's murder. The evidence, Eric's blood-stained watch, Catherine's lies to the police, painted a damning picture of her complicity. But Catherine's defense took a different approach. They argued that she had been manipulated, just like Annabelle, and potentially other women who had yet to come forward. The defense portrayed her as a woman trapped in a failing marriage, desperate for emotional connection, and vulnerable to the manipulative control of Father Nicholas. They claimed that Catherine had never intended for Eric to die, And while she had been drawn into the priest's web of deceit, she had not been responsible for her husband's death. The trial's most explosive moment came when the prosecution introduced a secret recording made by Father Nicholas in the days leading up to the murder. The recording, found in the priest's cabin, was a conversation between Father Nicholas and Catherine, during which she expressed her frustrations with Eric. Her words, "Maybe it would be easier if he were just gone," echoed through the courtroom. Though not a direct admission of guilt, the statement cast a long shadow over Catherine's defense. It showed that, at the very least, she had considered Eric's death as a way out of her unhappy marriage. In the end, the jury's decision reflected the complexity of the case. Catherine was found guilty of conspiracy and obstruction of justice, sentenced to a lengthy prison term. Though the court could not definitively prove her direct involvement in Eric's murder, her actions had undeniably contributed to the events that led to his death. Father Nicholas, already facing life imprisonment for the murder, was handed additional charges for his predatory behavior. Brooksville, once known for its quiet charm, now carried the weight of a scandal that would haunt it for years to come. As St. Andrew's Church, the heart of the community, stood abandoned, a hollow shell of its former self, a symbol of the betrayal that had taken place within its walls. The people of the town, forever changed by the tragedy, moved on, but the scars remained. For Catherine, prison offered no reprieve. Each day in her cell was a reminder of the choices she had made, the lies, the affair, the murder of her husband. As she stared out of the small window, watching the world she would never return to, Catherine was left to reckon with the knowledge that her decisions had sealed her fate. In the end, the collapse of the illusion that had once masked Brooksville's dark truths was complete. The town would never forget what had happened. The scandal, the betrayal, and the tragic loss of life had left an indelible mark, one that no amount of time could erase. As the world moved on, Brooksville remained forever changed, its quiet streets now haunted by the ghosts of its past. The story has been edited to ensure personal privacy and security regarding names and locations. Thanks for watching. If you like the video, don't forget to subscribe to see the latest and most thrilling family crime stories.